Hello, lovely people. Hopefully, it's gonna be the last week of this nasty cold. Warmer weather is coming. So, today we'll be talking. Ooh, it's a mess. About this thing. If you watched the previous video, in this box I had an Alpine HDZ, the status line subwoofer. I didn't really like how it sounds because this box was not designed for that subwoofer. It's way too big and it's tuned way too low. It is a ported box with a port over there, and I got this one from one of my followers. It was donated for the channel and I decided to try this one. So this is an old school Xplod subwoofer that everybody knows. You can still buy them. I'm not sure if it's the same model. It's, what does it say, peak power. I think it's like 300 watts. It's a 12-inch. It's just your old school Xplod with a pentagon shape. And this subwoofer is much more suitable for a box such as this. So what are we going to do in this video? In this video, I will try to correlate objective measurements from the subwoofer with my subjective opinions on how this subwoofer sounds. So I did describe how the Alpine HDZ sounds in this box, in this car with the same tune, and at the end of this video I will try to describe how this one sounds. So we will have a look at impedance graphs. We're going to compare this one with the Alpine. We're going to have a look at the frequency response, what is the difference, distortion, impulse, and all that kind of stuff. We're going to compare them and then see why this sounds different, because it does sound different than the Alpine. I can spoil you the end. It sounds much better. So without any further ado, let's jump into the laptop and let's have a look at the data. So first we're going to have a look at WinISD modeling. So these are both of these subwoofers, the Alpine Status and the Xplod, modeled in the same enclosure, which is 3 cubic feet and tuned to 25 Hertz. And to be honest, we can see that the response is almost identical. Like the Alpine has a little more output between 20 and 30 Hertz, and maybe like half a dB or 1 dB here at the top, but the modeling is almost identical. If we have a look at group delay, we're gonna see the biggest difference here. The Status has a much higher group delay, especially just a little bit below the tuning frequency. Tuning is 25 Hertz, and we have 34, whatever the unit is, and the Xplod has a much lower group delay. Now, if we're comparing to a sealed enclosure, this is what I'm planning to do, Alpine Status in sealed, and we can see the sealed box group delay is much lower, way all the way down there. But if we're comparing this Xplod versus the Alpine, in theory the Xplod should perform a little bit better because it has a much lower group delay. If we go back to transfer function and we have a look at the sealed, and we're gonna add the sealed, yes, it does fall off quite early. We have an F3 of 47 Hertz. This is in 1 cubic foot when I'm planning to put this subwoofer in, and you can see why I wanted to try out these ported enclosures, because with the ported enclosure the F3 is 25 Hertz, which is super low. Secondly, we're gonna have a look at the impedance graphs of all of these enclosures. If you still remember from the video that I did about the ported versus sealed, this is the impedance graph of the Alpine Status subwoofer in this ported enclosure, and you can see that we have a little bit of a sharp bend here, and both of these peaks are not the same height, so we can kind of make a conclusion that this enclosure is very not optimal for this subwoofer. Now the Xplod, we have a very different picture. With the Xplod, we can see that this transition is much nicer. These two peaks are not the same height but closer to each other, because this Xplod, it has a much lower resonant frequency. The Status, I think, is like 30 or something, whereas the Xplod has probably like 24 or even 22 Hertz resonant frequency, which is much smaller, so it should perform much better in a lower tuned box. Now, one thing we note in this impedance graph is these three little squiggles wiggles, and you can see in the Alpine they're not there. So these squiggle wiggles are not because of the box, but they're because of the subwoofer driver itself. However, they're very high in frequency, 188 Hertz, so so it's not gonna affect the actual frequency response of this box. So these are the differences between the Alpine and the Xplod. The other thing you see is that the Alpine is wired in parallel, so we have 2 ohms load, whereas the Xplod is a single coil. It's a 4 ohm load into the amplifier. And now let's have a look at the frequency response. This is exactly the same location on the passenger side in the corner of the boot, and this is something similar that we can see from WinISD modeling as well, because I did mention that the Alpine has a little bit more level, like between 20 and 30 hertz, whereas this translates between 20 and 30, it translates into this massive peak that the Alpine has, whereas the Xplod, it doesn't have that peak. It has a bit more linear response, less peaky, and surprisingly below like 18, it has a little bit more output. Again, this could be due to the lower resonant frequency and the fact that this box is much more suitable for the Xplod. As well, Xplod offers a little bit more level, all the way up to like 120 hertz. You can see here we have probably 3 or 4 dB extra level, which again is very good for the crossover region. And overall, it is a bit nicer response, less peaky, and we do have level all the way down to 20 and below. So this is simple stuff. Now let's have a look at the sweeps and what we can see from that data. This is a distortion between these 2 drivers. Xplod is the green one and Alpine is the blue one. Distortion wise, playing the same level, you can see that the Xplod has lower distortion, surprise, surprise, especially at lower frequencies, like this part between 60 and 30 or like 27. It's kind of the same, but below that, the Alpine has much higher distortion compared to the Xplod. And again, this is just to the fact that this enclosure is much more suitable for the Xplod compared to the Alpine, because this 25 and below, it's the port. So it's very interesting to see that the distortion caused mainly by the port is influenced by the actual driver and not only the port itself. If we have a look at the group delay, there's not a big of a difference, especially like all the region is kind of the same. The biggest difference we can see at the, again, port tuning frequency and slightly below, where the Xplod has a little bit less group delay, which we can see here peak at about 78 milliseconds and Alpine peaks at 110. So I do believe that this group delay kind of transfers into the fact that I mentioned when I was playing the Alpine, and all the higher frequencies, the ones in the crossover region that's supposed to blend with the mid-bass driver, they are in time and you can hear them hitting at the same time, whereas the super low frequencies, they kind of get disattached from the front and they do play almost like a separate thing. And now the biggest difference is here in the impulse. This is the 2 impulses, one of the Alpine and one of the Xplod. Let me just slightly reduce this so we can see it better. Now here is the biggest difference that we can see. The Alpine, you can see it just wiggles and it goes all the way up to almost half a second, 500 milliseconds, whereas the Xplod has a much shorter impulse. It does wiggle down to like 350, but the biggest peaks last only like 126 milliseconds, and after that they're very small. So now what kind of conclusions can we make from this? So now I have kind of a theory that this impulse, not necessarily group delay or anything, but the impulse is a thing that's causing the bass to be tight or very loose. With the Alpine, when we see all of this long impulse, that what makes it kind of dissociated from the front, because the front drivers are very fast, they have a short impulse, and the subwoofer in the very back, it kind of stretches out the bass and everything. So what I heard with this Xplod is that it sounds much better, miles better compared to the Alpine driver. It does have a little bit of dragging at the very low frequencies, and again, this could be due to this group delay that is much higher at the port tuning frequency. It could be due to the port. So the bass below 30 hertz, it is dragged out, is stretched out, is nothing even close to the infinite baffle subwoofer that I have, but it is much better than the Alpine. Another thing that I wanted to show you is the frequency response in regards to the whole system. So this is when the whole system was playing, and this is, the Alpine is in green. So this is the response that we ended the last video with. This is like after the like final EQ adjustments and everything. When I just literally swapped the subwoofer without changing absolutely anything, I got this blue line, which is much more level just because that driver, even if it is a 4 ohm driver, it's still much more sensitive, and especially in this massive box, it gives me much more level. So I had to tone it down and re-EQ the actual subwoofer. And by re-EQ, I had this with a crossover, and then I chose a target level and I EQ'd it like this. So if you remember with the status driver, I can show you here actually, that this was with a crossover and this was EQ. So with the status, I had to cut a lot from the very bottom end because there was much too much energy, and I had to boost this area because it was not enough. So now the difference with the Xplod is that it is a bit flatter response, so that I don't have to boost this and I just have to cut this. So I can choose a little bit lower target and not lose too much energy at the, especially the very bottom end. And after all of this, after re-EQ'd everything, I got this line, which was kind of almost the same as I had with the Alpine driver. So I had a listen for a couple of days, the only difference being a different driver in the same box. And you can see that from 25 all the way up to 110, this sub bass is exactly the same level. This difference in level was because I was measuring the response while sitting in the passenger seat because I was doing time alignment and everything. So for the sub bass, it doesn't really matter, but it affects the response in higher frequencies. That's why the response is the same, it's just measured differently. That's why it looks like this. And again, as I mentioned, with the same house curve, with the same levels and everything, the sound of sub bass is very different. And I want to say the biggest difference is in the range, probably between like 30-35 and up to like 50, which is like this range, because this range above 60, whereas the crossover region with the mid bass, as I mentioned, the Alpine was good as well, but the Alpine felt very loose and everything like in the lower frequencies, whereas now the Xplod sounds much nicer in this area. However, everything below like 25, all of this, it does have a little bit of level, it does play it, but compared to Infinite Baffle, you cannot compare it because it sounds totally different. The IB sounds million times better than this. So ported, even if it's tuned low and it plays all the way down to 20, the response is there, but it doesn't sound as good. So what did this experiment taught me? It taught me that you really need to match the subwoofer with the box. That means you have to make the enclosure according to the subwoofer. If you have a subwoofer that is not optimized for your enclosure, you will be disappointed by the results. It doesn't matter how expensive that driver is. The Alpine Status driver, it costs a lot of money. It's a super expensive driver, but put it in a wrong enclosure and you're gonna have very bad results. This costs literally nothing to me. You can find it for like probably like £50 online on eBay or Facebook Marketplace. And to be honest, it performs good. It has very little X-Max, like probably like 7mm of X-Max. That's why ported enclosure, where you have that support from the port, is much better than sealed for it. However, it needs a lot of space. You can see it takes like a third of my boot, but it's super efficient. Even with that amplifier that does probably like 300 watts into 4 ohms, which is close to the RMS rating of the subwoofer, it does give me plenty of output. Not as much as I would want to. Probably I would want a second driver to have enough, but for daily, it's plenty enough. Now, I have this data from this, especially the impulse, because it might be a coincidence, but I think that the impulse has the biggest influence of how the driver sounds. So the next step is going to be to make a small sealed enclosure, 1 cubic foot, for the Alpine HDC driver, as I mentioned in the previous video, and measure exactly the same stuff, compare the impulse and see if that impulse translates into what people probably call fast bass. I don't want to use that term fast bass, but I really don't know how to describe it in any other way. So for now, I'm gonna have this for a week or so. Then when weather is gonna be a bit nice, when it's gonna be warmer, I'm gonna make a sealed enclosure and we'll make another video comparing this to the Alpine Status in sealed. I hope this was informative for you, because these experiments measurements, teach me a lot of stuff because I never played with ported boxes before. I always had sealed and infinite baffle. This is my first ported box in a car when I'm actually doing the measurements and stuff. So stay tuned for future updates. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.